My name is John Spinney. I'm with the Vermont Agency of Education. I'm in my 20th year here at the AOE. And today is designed to be sort of a underlying background to the transition plan and giving you sort of the all around information that you need for the transition plan. Whereas the last training I did really focused more on the best practices. And yes, I could email everybody that registered this PowerPoint. And like I said a minute ago, the links that you're going to see are live in here. So you should be able to click those this time. All right, so keep putting your questions in the chat and I will get to those at the end. All right. I like to have this slide in because at the end of the day, it all comes down to this. So of course, we're going to go over some of these compliance items that are related to Indicator 13 and the monitoring system. But at the end of the day, like that transition plan should give your student those skills. What skills do they need to be successful after they graduate? In light of how their disability impacts their future employment, education or training, or independent living. So you should have this lens in your head every single time you go to an IEP meeting for a high school student. You should be thinking about how does their disability impact their future things, their future activities? And how can you as a special educator help them get the skills they need to be successful? So I want to encourage you, no matter how deep we get into compliance stuff, this is where the rubber hits the road. Is your transition plan in the IEP helping that student get the skills they need? All right, so this is the Indicator 13 is a part of our state performance plan that we report to the feds on. And there are 8 elements to Indicator 13. And I know there's just a whole lot of text there, so I like to have it broken out like this. So the 8 items, we're going to go through these today. We're going to go through each aspect of these 8 elements, and then we're going to go over some common compliance pitfalls that folks fall into. And then we're going to pull up our biggest transition resource, and we're going to go through some exemplar transition plans at the end. So the first aspect to this is that there should be evidence that the student was invited to the IEP meeting. There should be evidence of invitation to other agencies like Voc Rehab, Higher Ability, Developmental Services, Mental Health, DCF, VSAC, whoever it may be. And of course, you need to have the consent of the parent or the student who's of the age of majority. And if you don't have that consent, you have to clearly state that, and we'll get to that. There needs to be age-appropriate transition assessment, and those are the assessments that are looking at the student's strengths, needs, preferences, and interests as they relate to that student's future. Excuse me. There needs to be measurable post-secondary goals / outcomes. Those are different than the annual IEP goals. Those are outcomes that take place after graduation. That's sometimes hard for special educators to get their head around because it's different than what you're used to, especially if you came from the elementary or middle school side. There needs to be corresponding annual IEP transition goals. And those are the goals that are developing those skills we were just talking about. The post-secondary goals need to be updated annually. So as your student gets closer and closer to graduation, you should be reviewing those post-secondary outcomes, making sure they're still relevant and accurate, and refine them each year. There needs to be transition services, and those are the services that are going to help your student meet those annual goals. This is an area also where there is oftentimes confusion, where a special educator might put a transition service or an activity. It's something the student is going to do. and it might take them just a day or two to do this activity. And they put it where the annual goals are, and that is problematic, and we'll get to that and discuss. And there needs to be a course of study. And this is not saying, hey, you have to put every single course that the student is going to take prior to graduation. It's not saying that. It is asking for, it's saying basically, hey, IEP team, what are the most critical courses connected to this student meeting the post-secondary goals? And the feds have included this aspect so that if your student moves to a new high school, the new high school can implement those courses right off the bat without having to reinvent the, so to speak, transition wheel, right? If you could mute yourself, folks, or I can do it real quick.
I got you, John.
Oh, thank you. And at the end of the training, if you want to come on and ask questions, of course, there's gonna be time for that, but you can also put the questions in the chat. So I got a couple slides here where it's just kind of like at a glance to give just the whole picture here. I have two different ways of showing this. So, the transition process starts with getting the results of these transition assessments. These are the assessments measuring the strengths, needs, preferences, and interests as they relate to the student's future employment, future higher ed, or future independent living. By the way, sometimes we get these transition plans that are sent from high schools, and there won't be any transition assessments completed, but yet the rest of the plan is complete. So that leaves us scratching our heads, and it's a significant red flag because we don't know how you actually created the transition plan without assessment data. It all starts with this assessment data. Post-secondary goals are created once you have that assessment data. These are those outcomes that take place after graduation. They're observable. They're not a process. The student will be employed in the culinary industry. It's observable. And that outcome goes directly into the summary of performance prior to graduation. So this transition plan is aligned to that summary of performance. Next up, after you, as an IEP team, you've identified these post-secondary goals / outcomes, you really have to discuss as a team, what are the skills, what are the most critical skills that student needs to meet those outcomes? Have that discussion. Be clear about that. If it's a student you've worked with for a long time, you probably know what skills they need right off the top of your head, potentially. So that's important, and that information should go right into the next phase, which is the development of those annual IEP transition goals, which are designed to develop those skills. And then once you have those annual IEP goals, now you have to look at, well, what transition services are needed to support that student in meeting those goals? And then what are the courses they need to not only meet those goals, but keep moving themselves closer to reaching those outcomes that they hope to reach after they graduate. And hopefully they meet their post-school outcomes, their desired post-school outcomes. This is just another slide that says the same thing as the last slide, just in a slightly different way. And I also have the link to the transition assessment planning tool, and you should be able to click that and open that. It lives on the Vermont Family Network website. I've been referencing this tool for like over 15 years. It's a really, really great tool for you as a team, especially for your younger students that are maybe getting their first transition plan and you're preparing for that initial IEP transition planning meeting and you're not sure what assessments should be done. You're not even sure where to start. That's a nice tool to discuss as a team and start to make an action plan for what assessments you're going to use. If you were a part of the last training, you actually would have received an email that had lots of transition assessment resources. So hopefully you got that if you were at that. And if folks do want more transition assessment resources, I could certainly send that again with the PowerPoint. So like I said, I'm not going to just sort of repeat everything on this slide, but it's just another way of at a glance to kind of give you a sense of the flow here for what we're doing when it comes to the transition plan. Sure, Kelly, got it. That sounds good. All right. All right, so we're going to kind of go through these 8 elements and talk through that a bit, and then we're going to look at some common pitfalls, and then we're going to go through and look at some good goals, and then look at some more transition plan examples. So this part's pretty straightforward, but you'd be surprised how many times here at the AOE we receive transition plans that don't pass through this. And it's often because they did not put the date. So just try to get that ingrained as a habit. So when you invite the student to that transition planning meeting, you need to show evidence of that invitation. And you also need to clearly show the date that they were invited. If there's no date, it's going to be flagged. And remember, indicator 13 is very it's very strict. We didn't create the strictness. This came from the feds. So if one thing on one plan is flagged, like just one date, I know that can be frustrating, but that will flag the whole entire plan, making it out of compliance, even though it just has that one issue. So please don't let that happen to you or your transition plan that you wrote with your IEP team. Make sure the dates are there and it's very clear. So outside agencies also need to be invited. And the date needs to be also very clear around the date you have invited those folks. Now, if you don't have consent, you need to clearly state that, because of course you can't control that. And if the family is not open to outside agencies yet, that is common, then you would want to clearly state that. I will say, and this is the soundbite to try to, and it's more than just a soundbite, it's actually a truth here. So when your student graduates and they leave the entitlements and the protections of special education and they're out there in the world, if you have helped them facilitate in having a relationship with higher ability, at least with higher ability, they are now in their corner. They no longer have you in their corner. They've left the world of education. They do not have access to special education anymore after they graduate. However, if you've made that connection to higher ability, they at least have somebody that can kind of get them going in the right direction. So if they need assistive technology, they can help with that. They need to try to find a job, they can help with that. They need to try to find some services for something, they can help with that. They can help with a whole variety of things. Whether it's the transition counselor or the adult side of higher ability. They are an asset, and I'll always be encouraging you to encourage the family to make those connections. Transition assessments. This is a nice way of, I like this definition. I've used this for quite a few years. So transition assessment is an ongoing process. It's not just a one and done thing. So if your student's a freshman and you have a transition plan that they're starting in freshman year, each year you potentially are going to be adding a transition assessment. That's an IEP team decision as far as, well, what else do we need to add in? And that's where that planning form that I linked on the last slide can help you. So it's this ongoing process of collecting data on the individual's needs, preferences, and interests as they relate to the demands of current and future working, educational, living, and personal and social environments. Assessment data serve as the common thread in the transition process and form the basis for defining the goals and services to be included in the IEP. So this is just kind of an example of what that transition assessment section might look like for a student. And we're going to look at some other examples as well later. So along the left-hand side, you have what assessment was used, and then you have the date. And you want to think of this section, this chart, as a cumulative list. So let's say you did some assessments prior to the student's first transition plan. And then a year later, you added one or two more transition assessments. You want to just add those along. You don't need to get rid of the old ones. So this is kind of one area of the transition plan that will carry forward. And again, it's up to the IEP team as far as what else do you want to pull into the fold here. There are hundreds of transition assessments out there, from very informal things to very formal. So it's designed to be something that you can customize to the situation and the student and their needs, and what else do you need to gather in terms of that student's strengths, needs, preferences, and interests. So sometimes we'll see a transition plan that comes to us and this whole chart is just missing. Obviously, that's a red flag. There's nothing we can do. We have to flag that. So if you're working on a transition plan in EdDoc or something, and you don't see this chart, that's a problem. So try to find out why it's not populating. Always need to have this chart in the transition plan. All right. I just saw a question come in. I'm going to address that later. I'm going to try to address all the questions at the end. But thank you. Keep those questions coming. Okay, some definitions here. The post-secondary goals, remember, is an entirely different type of goal than the annual IEP goals. It's an outcome. It is this thing that is going to take place after they graduate. It's observable. It's not a process. Sometimes we might see a post-secondary goal written like, the student hopes to do XYZ, or the student plans to do XYZ. Those imply a process and are not an observable outcome. So what I would say to you is, so take that, whatever that plans to or hopes to thing is, and what's the ultimate next stage? What's that sort of end observable stage of whatever that is? And it's typically things like will be employed, will be enrolled, will be participating. Okay. So push them back out to that observable outcome. And remember that you want to have those nice, clean, solid, observable outcomes, because that's also going to what is going to go into the summary of performance, which is essentially a passport that you're helping your student get. And that passport could go to a future employer, could go to a future student support office at a college. It could go to the developmental services office. We do have an existing training on the summary of performance on the secondary transition part of the website. And if people need more information about the summary of performance, I do have we're going to touch on it a little bit more here as well, a little bit later. Okay, measurable annual IEP transition goals. They should be in SMART goal format. And again, they're designed to build the skills. If we see an annual goal that is basically like the student is going to research something and then they're done, that's really an activity. Okay, it's not an annual goal. The annual goal should be something that it should be meaty. It should be something that they can't just do in 1 or 2 days. It's something that they're going to need to work on throughout the life of that annual IEP. And it's working on the skills they need, right? And next up, we have transition services and activities. And these are provided by the LEA to help prepare students with disabilities to move from school to post-school life. These are activities that support the student in meeting those annual IEP transition goals. Some examples of transition services and activities are around instruction, related services, community experiences, could be work-based learning, training, designed to improve employment, could be transportation training. These are just a couple examples. I do have another recorded training on our secondary transition part of the website that gets more into transition services and the differences between goals. So we're going to go through a couple examples of post-secondary goals / outcomes. So this was an old case study that came through our secondary transition TA center, a student named Paulo. So within 1 year, this is for education and training. The student's post-secondary goal is within 1 year of graduation, Paulo will be enrolled in a habilitative and functional skills course through his developmental services agency. Okay, it's this observable thing. He will be enrolled in this. Oops. For employment, within 1 year of graduation, Paulo will be employed a minimum of 20 hours a week at the grocery store for competitive pay. It's observable. Independent living, within 1 year of graduation, Paulo will be communicating with his communication device. Okay, so you have these observable outcomes. You're in the, let's just think about, we're in the IEP meeting. We've gone through the transition assessments. We've created these post-secondary outcomes. Now, what are the skills? What skills does the student need? Okay, and as we discuss those skills, we then create these annual IEP goals. So for education and training, Paulo will become proficient with his augmentative communication device by using the device to answer questions about classroom content within 1 minute of the question and without needing any assistance 10 times in a row by May of this school year. Employment. At the grocery store work-based learning experience, Paulo will independently perform a variety of tasks, including but not limited to gathering carts, stocking shelves, janitorial duties, to the level determined to be proficient by his job coach and manager for 5 days in a row by May of this school year. So sometimes we'll receive transition plans that will have an annual goal, but has no date of it it's expected to be completed. So if there's no date, that's the T in the SMART, right? It's time sensitive. There needs to be a due date that the student is expected to meet that goal. And if there's no date, it's going to get flagged. Independent living in all community settings, Paulo will use his communication device independently to communicate with novel audience that they understand him every time for 2 weeks by May of this school year. Excuse me. All right. So now that that student has post-secondary goals, they have annual goals. What are the transition services, these support activities that the student needs to meet those annual goals? So for education and training, it's going to be transportation support, augmentative communication evaluation, and the device with loan device until his arrives, community-based instruction. For employment, school-based and then community-based job coaching as necessary, visual instruction, visual cues, reminders, and or templates, most to least prompting, specific praise and reinforcement. Independent living, transition services checklist, transportation, and augmentative communication device. Okay, the course of study. This is often where there is some confusion. So what are we talking about? The course of study is a multi-year description of coursework to achieve the student's desired post-school goals from the student's current year to the anticipated exit year. And that's the part where people get tripped up. So for example, we will sometimes see a transition plan that gets submitted that will, let's say it's a sophomore, and it will include the course of study just has the sophomore year, does not have junior and senior year. That is going to be something that gets flagged, unfortunately. So it has to go from the current year through to the anticipated exit year. And if you have a student with intensive needs or has developmental disabilities, and the IEP team has determined that the student is going to stay in high school a little bit longer than their typical peers, you can have on that course of study, let's say they're a sophomore at the time, you'd have 10th, 11th, and 12th, and then you could have 12 plus and 12 plus plus to indicate those additional years on the course of study. And remember, we're not talking about every course required for graduation. We're not talking about that. We're talking about what are the most critical courses the student needs to meet the post-secondary goals. So when we see a course of study, to us, it's a narrative in a sense from the IEP team. The IEP team is saying, look, these are the most critical courses this kid needs. We're not judging what courses those are. We just need to know from the current year to the anticipated exit year, what are those most critical courses? All right, so this next little phase, we're going to go over some reminders and some common areas where folks have problems with compliance in terms of if your LEA, if your high school is a part of a monitoring cycle. So if you came to my last training, this is where there's a little bit of overlap. I wanted to include some of these things because I think it's important. So, make sure that the IEP meeting date in the upper right corner is correct. Make sure the student is invited and make sure the date of the invitation is listed. Make sure outside agencies are invited and the date is included. If there's no parent or adult student consent, then state that. Make sure that transition assessments are listed and they take place before the IEP meeting date. The IEP meeting is to discuss the results and create the plan. The one exception is a student interview on the same day as the IEP meeting is okay, and we sometimes see that. There's nothing wrong with that. The problem is if there are assessments listed and the dates of all those assessments is after your IEP meeting date, then it, like I said, it leaves us wondering, well, what data did you use to create the plan if you hadn't done the assessments yet? So that's a problem. Assessments are always something that would be done first before you make your transition plan. Make sure that your post-secondary goals are outcomes, not a process. Make sure the annual IEP goals are focused on a skill they need to develop throughout the life of the IEP, and is not something that can be done in a day or two. If the student goes by a name different than what is at the top of the IEP, please indicate the other name in the student invite section. Otherwise, this can be very confusing for the folks that receive at AOE, our monitoring team, and myself, when we get transition plans where it has the name at the top, and then the rest of the plan is using a different name, but there's nothing to indicate this name difference. It's confusing, and we wonder, well, is this some kind of mix-up where they pasted in the wrong student's information into the plan, and it's typically not that. It's just that the student does have a different nickname, or a name they go by. So in that student invitation section, just please indicate that. So just make that distinction, please. Common areas of noncompliance. So I broke these out into 4 areas. So dates, we've talked about that. So we're talking about the IEP meeting dates, invite dates, transition assessment dates. And there's even another area which I should have added on here, is making sure that your annual goals have a date that the student is expected to finish it or achieve it. And that could just be, the date can be, in that case, by the end of this annual IEP. That's also a date, right? So there just has to be some type of bookend that the student is expected to meet that annual goal. Other areas of problems that we see, post-secondary goals not written as outcomes and are process-based. We also see confusion about annual goals versus a transition activity or service. If it's something the student can finish in a day or two, it's likely a transition activity or service. Course of study confusion only has the current year and does not go through the graduation year. All right, I'm going to probably pick up the pace a little bit here. So we've talked about this one a bit, but so if there's no dates listed for the student or outside agency invitations, or if the assessment dates are after the IEP meeting date, that's a concern, because it's like, well, what data did you use to create the plan if you did it after you wrote the plan? Post-secondary goals written as a process. So, for example, within 1 year of graduation, the student plans to find a job. This implies a process. So the correction would be within 1 year of graduation, the student will be employed in the hospitality industry. You want to land on that observable end outcome, not the process that led up to it. Excuse me. And like I said, those post-secondary outcomes are going to go directly into your summary performance as that student gets closer to graduation. All right. Some other areas of confusion are with the difference between these annual IEP goals versus a transition activity or a service. So the student will research and apply to 2 to 3 local companies that specialize in construction or excavation. So it's non-compliant because support to research and apply to these programs is a transition service. There's no date and no identified way to measure the student learning. Annual IEP goals should address a skill the student needs in light of how their disability impacts their future. Here's another example. Student will research and apply to any pertinent training or licensing programs or tech schools required for their heavy machinery career. Same reason that it's a transition activity and a service, really. So the support to help that student do that research and get the information they need on those licensing programs, and that's something school counselors can do as well. It's a transition service. So we don't want to get rid of it, but it should not be where the annual goals are. So if the IEP team is talking about these kinds of services and activities, which is great, put it into the transition services section, identify who's going to be offering that support and the dates, and you're good to go. You just don't want to have that written as your annual goal. Another example, by January 25th, student will explore education and training required to work in the cosmetology field and identify at least 3 entrance criteria to be admitted into the program. So the correction for that would be, in order to be prepared for the rigors of cosmetology school, the student will improve her reading comprehension as demonstrated by 85% accuracy on teacher-created reading comprehension assessments in 4 out of 5 attempts in the IEP period ending 11/21/25. So that's just an example. Like in this case, the IEP team is saying that reading comprehension is a critical skill for this student. Okay. Now, this would be a great transition service that the school counselor might be able to support. So that, again, will go in the transition services section. This one we've talked about quite a bit. Course of study, just make sure it goes through to the anticipated graduation year. Okay, so some of you may have come to the graduation readiness tool training. That link, the recorded training is actually live, and you should be able to click that link. if you wanted access to that training. The actual tool is in the final steps of getting posted on the website and is not up yet. The difference between the new tool and the tool that was created in 2017 is that it's pivoted to access points versus readiness points. So the original version sort of asked the IEP team to assess how ready for graduation the student was based on all these components. The components are still there, and there's more components now, and the IEP team is being asked to assess how much access the student has had to those components. So that's the shift with the new tool, and the recorded training walks through that. I encourage you as all of you special educators here that have students that are, high school students, I would encourage you to use the graduation readiness tool starting in freshman year and use it at every annual IEP meeting. And just to be looking at, well, what things are coming down the pipeline that we want to make sure that our student has access to. Okay. So the summary performance. So there's a example summary performance in that link. You should be able to click that. And then there is the one-page special educator self-assessment for the summary performance. You should be able to click that as well. That is a lot like how we have the one-page indicator 13 self-assessment sheet, which I can include that in the email when I forward the. I probably should have had a link for that one-pager for the transition plan as well. I can email that. All right, so this link right here, and we're going to go look at this. If you're here, you care about transition planning, you care about students with disabilities, you care about the work you do. We at AOE put a lot of time into this resource. We looked at what other state education agencies were doing around having a comprehensive technical assistance guide for the IEP transition plan. We consulted with our federal partners, our technical assistance partners, and this is the tool we created. Well, it's more of it's a resource, really. It's a white paper. So I wanted us to, hopefully you can see my screen. I'm not sure if, Cassie, if you're out there, can you see my screen, or do you still see just what's on the PowerPoint?
John,
Just the
John, we still
slide,
just see the
yeah.
PowerPoint. Yeah.
Okay,
You might need to unshare and reshare.
yeah. So I'm gonna do this. Okay. Hopefully you see that now.
Yep.
All right, so let's just go down to at the end of this resource are these transition plan samples, and I've got like 4 of them. I just wanted to walk through a couple of these transition plans. These were not written by AOE. These were written by actual Vermont LEAs with the names all redacted. So let's just take a look. So this is a 12th grader. The IEP meeting date was 11/8/22. Parent and student were invited by the meeting notice dated 11/3/22. Both were in attendance. These are these 4 plans passed our monitoring system. So these are compliant, exemplar transition plans. So keep that date in your head, 11/8/22. So these outside agency folks, mental health, I-team, and higher ability members were invited through the meeting notice dated 11/3. This next section, this coordinated interagency section, this is a little bit peripheral to indicator 13, but we included this in the template because it's really for any services that any of the outside agencies are going to be providing. that are directly related to transition, just you can list them here. Okay, don't forget that date, 11/8/22. All these assessments took place before that date. So they list the name of the assessment, the summary of the results. They've listed out the strengths, needs, preferences, and interests based on those results. Post-secondary goals. After high school, a student will successfully complete employment training through her designated developmental services agency. That's the observable outcome. The rest of this is not working against you, or in this case, the student. It's some additional information. It doesn't necessarily need to go right there, but it's not going to be a potential flag. As long as the observable outcome is clearly stated for that post-secondary goal. As long as that's there, that's the key that you need. Employment. After graduation, the student will work 20 hours a week in a supported employment setting. That's the observable outcome. Independent living. After graduation, student will independently maintain a hygiene routine in preparing for work each day. That's the observable outcome. So remember, like I was saying, anytime we talk about post-secondary goals / outcomes, we want to instantly trigger our brain into thinking, well, what are the skills the student needs in light of their disability? And those skills are what you want to build with these annual goals. So by November of 23, student with guidance and support will write about her daily experience one time a week using photo prompts or sentence starters to support her completing the writing 3 out of 4 times during a month. The writing pieces with a minimum of 3 sentences each will serve as evidence of completion of the goal. So it has the date it's expected to be finished. It's very clear. This is something the student's going to be working on. When we read this at AOE, we interpret this as the IEP team is saying this is addressing a critical skill that the student needs. We're not judging which skills you focus on. We just need to know that you are focused on a skill and it's clearly written how you're going to go about that. Employment. By November of 23, the student will recognize sequences and complete patterns that include pictures, items, and numbers 4 out of 5 times, which could connect toward job skills. Progress will be monitored by the special educator. By November of 23, the student will use a checklist to document the steps followed for her daily hygiene routine. These steps will include showering, washing her face, combing her hair with 100% accuracy 6 out of 8 times within a month. Our post-secondary goals updated annually. You always should make sure that, yes, you are reviewing that every year and refining those as needed, and that you've checked yes right here. Transition services. These are the services to help that student meet those annual goals. So for education and training, there's augmentative communication device, prompting with specific praise reinforcement when responding using device supported by SLP and mental health BI. Consultation support for additional resources with the augmented communication device through the I-team. Transition services for employment. Transportation support, community-based job placement with coaching support from BI and behavior analyst through mental health and voc rehab consultation, support for transition goals with the IEP team. Sorry, the I-team, which is part of CDCI if you're not familiar. They're excellent resource for students with complex needs. Just remember that your transition services have a start date and an end date as well. Independent living transition services, app-supported activities with step-by-step instruction, augmentative communication device support by SLP and mental health BI, consultation support for additional resources with the augmented communication device through the I-team. and it lists who is responsible and the start date and the end date. Course of study. So remember, that was a 12th grader, right? And in this case, the IEP team has decided to have the student continue for several years. So what they've done is they put 12 plus, 12 plus plus, etc. And the coursework that is listed here is essentially the IEP team saying this is the most critical coursework that this particular student needs. Okay, remember, we're not judging exactly what courses are there. We just need to know, hey, IEP team, what are the most critical areas of coursework that this kid needs prior to graduation? And that's it. So I'm looking at the time. There's actually 3 more sample transition plans. I would encourage you to go and look at those, but I think I should pivot and start looking at the questions that we have.
Sounds good, John. Do you want me to read them aloud or?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, okay. So I'm going to scroll up to our first ones. You might have already answered this about linking to the slides or if slides will be available. And I think you mentioned that you'll share them out to the group.
Yep.
Cool. And you're still sharing screen, so you know. Kelly Ryan was asking if you could share that again, and I believe that's related to the transition assessments.
Okay. Yeah,
you know what I mean?
I can send those transition assessment resources out.
Okay, cool.
Again.
Emily asked, go ahead.
Can you repeat assessments from year to year and update the information each year? That's really an IEP team decision, but yes. I mean, like if it's an assessment that makes sense to kind of repeat it, and it allows you to kind of go a little deeper or get some more information. We're getting some echo in here. Hold on, let me just fix this. Okay.
There we go.
So the answer is yes, you can, and that's an IEP team decision.
Liz asks, what happens when you create a post-secondary goal, but something gets in the way of them being able to accomplish it?
So basically, you've created this outcome that takes place after they graduate, and something happens that they're not able to meet that goal. That, life can obviously happens, and when they leave the world of special ed and they exit high school, you don't have control over what's happening. So that could happen. However, we want to prepare for a best case scenario so that you've created these outcomes, and now you are thinking through what skills do they need, right? And then you're making the goals, and you're making this meaningful process to help the student. And if for some reason that outcome can't happen or doesn't happen, or there's an accident or health issue or any number of potential things, it's unfortunate, but that could happen. But there's no case law out there where anybody has come back and tried to sue the school district because the student didn't meet the post-secondary goal. What you're on the hook for as an LEA is the access to transition, those services and supports, and that you have each year that student was enrolled in your school and on an IEP, you helped them with developing those skills through annual goals and having a compliant transition plan. And that's what you're on the hook for. So there's only so much you can control, but yeah, that could happen. So let's see, we can keep going here.
Okay.
Communication goals. Terrible. A lot of these goals I pulled from the field, and so we see all sorts of different kinds of goals. We had goals from the feds as well, from our TA folks. So I hear what you're saying, Michelle. It is what it is. We see all sorts of levels of quality of goals when we receive plans. So, like I said, at the end of the day, Does your transition plan give your student those skills? Like that is the ultimate end all question. And if the answer is yes, then you're doing right by that student, right? And then the compliance aspect is only going to help support that.
Irene writes, I often write goals using the phrase by the student's annual review date. Is this still okay?
Absolutely, yes, that's perfect. So that would indicate the date that the IEP team is saying that the student is expected to meet this goal, and that's perfect. So you have to have that date, and you can write it that way. That's perfectly fine. Yep.
Jen asks, when you go and like share out the PowerPoint and all the resources, if you have a approved and like a good sample of a transition plan.
Yep, that's what what we were just looking at in that resource. So, you know, it's the writing quality transition plans, that last big resource we were just looking at. So please bookmark that, use that. We spent a lot of time developing that, and that is for the use of you all. So please use it. And there are lots of example goals, not just in the back. So there's those sample transition plans in the back that are actual exemplars from the field here in Vermont. But then in each individual section of those 8 elements, we have other examples listed in those sections as well. All right.
And then our last question, and John, I don't know if you have the survey link already. Oh, another one.
I do. I can put it in. Yep.
Okay, yeah, you might want to put that in the chat. We have about 5 minutes left. Emily writes, for courses to be taken, do you need to list the previous years? For example, if you have an 11th grade student, do you need to list the courses that were taken in 9th and 10th grade, or do you only list what is current and what will be to come?
So good question. And as far as indicator 13 goes, the compliance aspect is from the current year to the exit year. So if it's a sophomore, you don't have to include freshman year. However, if you do put freshman year, it's not a problem. That's not going to be a flag. So it's from the current year and forward. And the purpose, like I said, is the feds wanted that in there so that if your student moves to a new high school, the new high school can implement those courses right off the bat.
When you inherit an IEP and post-secondary goals need to be adjusted because they are no longer applicable, can we do that?
Yeah, I mean, of course. So you're going to need to have an IEP meeting, and you might want to add some new assessment, pull from some new assessment data prior to that meeting. But yes, you know, you have to work with the student and the family, and students' interests change, right? So absolutely, you want to update that and make it reflect the realness of the situation. Because if you have a transition plan that student's not invested in because it's not relevant to them, it's not gonna support them and help them in the way that we want, right? So those outcomes need to be directly tied to that student's strengths, needs, preferences, emphasis on preferences in this case, and needs. So yes, you would update that to reflect all those things.
Awesome.
I put the link to the post the training survey in the chat. When you fill out that survey, it will email you a certificate of attendance.
Thanks, John. That was the last question.
Okay. Well, thank you everybody for coming.